This episode is supported by World of Learning Conference and Exhibition. Don't miss the leading L&D event returning to the NEC Birmingham on the 6th and 7th of October. Learn, discover, interact, network. Entry to the exhibition is free or upgrade for full conference access. Register now at learnevent.com.
Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to Great Minds on Learning. In this acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of learning theory, from the Greeks to the geeks. This season we're focusing on types of learning that don't happen in training rooms, lecture halls or learning management systems. Areas such as dog training and performing arts aren't generally looked to for inspiration by learning professionals, but Donald and John believe they should be. We begin with sport. Modern sports coaching is all about practice that is variable, contextual and informed by the plentiful data that technology provides. Join Donald and John as they ask what education and workplace learning might be missing out on. Could studying elite sports provide answers to falling retention rates and flatlining productivity?
So hi everybody and welcome to a new season of the Great Minds on Learning. I'm here as ever with my valued and knowledgeable co-host Donald Clark.
Hello.
This episode's all about sport, about learning in sport and what sport can tell us about learning. We're recording not that long after the semi-final of the World Cup, as a result of which the Argentinian team went through to the final and the English team didn't. But we are grateful for small mercies. Unusually for one of England's important international fixtures, there was no extra time, no penalties. Argentina was able to kill our chances and prolong our 60 years of hurt within a mere 90 minutes, allowing English people to get off to bed at a sensible hour, to awaken next morning, no doubt, to tear-sodden sheets, and then to enjoy the spectacle a few days later of Argentina being beaten in the final by Spain, very humiliatingly, and responding in a not completely sporting fashion, if you ask me. But Donald, a different experience for you, the World Cup this year, because you support Scotland and your team went out of the tournament. Oh, remind me when that was. It does seem like ages ago.
Well, we did go out, but we did have Morocco and Brazil. I mean, England, it was pretty strange, their trajectory through it, because you didn't play that many teams. But to be fair, I'm a big England supporter. You know, I've lived in Brighton for 41 years.
Oh.
I've seen Scotland in the World Cup. I went to Italy, and I've also seen England in the World Cup. I went to San Etienne to see them play Argentina. That was a long time ago, 1998 or something. That was the famous one where Beckham got sent off and they lost. It was all very fractious. And Argentina were horrible then, and they're horrible now.
Well, I can remember actually watching the 1966 World Cup, and there was a quarterfinal with Argentina where the manager Ramsey stopped the players, the England players, from exchanging T-shirts afterwards, because he said, "Don't do that, lads. They played like animals." And they were really dirty. They've always been a very dirty team, if you ask me.
Well, my friend Miguel reminded me, he's Mexican, he's in Mexico, we had regular exchanges. His famous line about the Argentinians, which everybody in Mexico and some parts of South America know, is that even their mothers don't like them. Which that's a pretty scathing criticism. But people forget, I think as well, people forget that Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay have had that reputation for decades. That's the way they play the game. It is horrible, I think. You know, and it really got out of control in the final. All that violence afterwards and so on.
Very nasty. Anyway, what we're demonstrating here, Donald, is that sport triggers strong emotions and rivalries, which speak to our kind of sense of group identity and national identity. Speaks of myths and stories and histories and much more. But it also involves a lot of training, coaching and learning. And we form our relationship with sport as individuals very early on. Myself, I had quite a sporty youth. Constant park football, because I lived next door to a park. Then at school, there was athletics, squash, tennis, skiing, cross-country runs. God, I remember those. A few ignominious appearances for the rugby second team. And then a bit after puberty, it all fell apart. So I went to an English grammar school. And that ate the public school tradition where you're either a hearty or an arty. To translate that for US viewers and listeners, you're either a jock or a nerd. And I was very definitely in the arty camp. Nowadays, I watch England internationals, follow the Tour de France, do the London to Brighton cycle run. That's about it. I mean, I tried to put on a sporty T-shirt for today. The people on YouTube will be able to see this. It's actually a rather poncy Paul Smith shirt with kind of coloured cycling caps on the top of it because, I'm an avid follower of the Tour de France. But Donald, what's your relationship with sport?
Well, I suppose it was the opposite, much simpler in a way, because I went to sort of, what Blair would call bog standard comprehensive, where the only sport I remember the PE department having badminton rackets and all sorts of stuff that was never used. Yeah. All we did is play football. And I played football every night for years on a grass verge, That was the only sport in the consciousness of the culture I grew up on. And it is, and still is massive in Scotland, as you saw in the World Cup. But I also was really a football fan. So throughout my sort of years as a youngster and teenager, I supported Glasgow Rangers and used to go and see them on the bus, both away and at home, because Scotland's I went to every football park in the sort of Premier Division in Scotland. And I was also, curiously, I had a really odd incident. I was at the Ibrox disaster where 66 people died, and I came down that staircase just before the disaster. We were at the bottom of the stairs coming out, and people in our bus were injured. Some never made it, and there was no mobile phones. My mother and father were, absolutely frantic because it was on the news. Yeah. And my dad was phoning the police in Glasgow and so on. And then it was about an hour and a half. I finally arrived home. It's still, what a day that was, the downside of sport. But I've always been a football fan. I'm a season ticket holder this year at Brighton and Hove. I've sponsored grassroots football in Scotland. I'm a sort of big believer in this podcast's interesting. I really am a big believer in sport being a formative thing for young people. But in terms of this podcast, however, I suppose the most formative experience for me has been through my two sons, who both I did Taekwondo for years and got to a very high level. And Callum, of course, he became the English champion and for a number of years. And then it was in the England team. And I used to go and see him being coached, of course, at high level, international level, go and see him fight all over the place, different countries. So I had a real insight into that international high level coaching in that very different context. So that in terms of I'm a football fan, but I'm generally, my interest in learning, I always was very curious to watch how people were coached in sport, how different it was from the world of training.
Yeah. So with that in view, Donald, please give us an overview of what we're going to cover today. It's a game of two halves, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Well, in the first half, let's focus really on sports coaching, how it's different from training, what it focuses on. And I think there's an interesting thing here which goes back to, we did a few podcasts. We mentioned Huizinga, in one on the gaming one, because you mentioned that earlier. Sport is such a universal cultural thing. Look at the World Cup. The viewing figures are extraordinary, the way in which football has captured the world in that sense. There's something deeply cultural about it, which makes it different from training. You wouldn't say that, training courses are culturally significant. So that makes it different. But I think there's a big thing. Another podcast we did where we mentioned Nick Shackleton-Jones, and I agree with him when he says that the world of training is stuck in the world of education. It mimics education. So people come out as graduates and they think that that's what training courses should be, when they're not really, I think. In fact, it's training in that sense is the very opposite. The pendulum needs to swing towards that notion of doing things, recognizing that context matters, doing matters, practice matters, and all those things are curiously missed out in L&D. We shove people through these very text, PowerPointy experiences in classrooms where they don't actually do anything. In fact, they're taken away from the context in which they work.
Yeah,
I think there's two other things I would add in addition to Nick's observation. A couple of things that captured the world of training and the world of L&D. First is Bloom, that ridiculous idea that, when they talk about Bloom's taxonomy, they only talk about the cognitive bit, the knowledge-based bit, that silly triangle, which you never had. Let's not go into that again, but we know how nonsense. They never mention the fact that the psychomotor domain, which you also, the action-based bit, or the affective domain, because those books were written later. So people think that Bloom is that little triangle, which is an act of gross stupidity. One, the pyramid or triangle never existed. Two, later on, along comes Laurie Anderson, his pupil, and says, no, Bloom didn't think this is what's right. Knowledge isn't at the bottom of a pyramid. It's sort of marbled like fat into the meat. So I think the world of training got captured by Bloom, which exacerbated Nick's point about it mimicking education. And then there's another just premise behind my thoughts on this, which is I read a really interesting book, which I mentioned before, I think, John, called The Gutenberg Parenthesis.
Oh, yeah.
In other words, I think we were captured by print and text. How every bit of e-learning is just text, graphics, multiple choice question. In the real world, you actually have to do things.
Yeah.
If you're a musician, you've been a musician, John, you ain't going to learn how to perform, play the guitar just from a book.
Yes.
Could be a bit of it. But by and large, it's about performance. It's about practice. It's about all those things. It's about playing in a band. It's about the social context.
Yeah.
It's all that sort of stuff. And that's what I'd like to talk about today, really.
Okay. So that sets us up not only for this episode, but for the whole season in a way, because this time on Great Minds on Learning, we are going to be talking about things that involve doing stuff as a part of learning. Very different from, knowledge worker in front of a computer type of stuff. The exact opposite. We're talking about performing arts and dog training and physical world things. We're kind of swimming against the current here, Donald. Everyone else is talking about AI absolutely non-stop. So if you're fed up with that, you'll be able to come to Great Minds on Learning this season and get in touch grass. Literally, and get in touch with the real world again. So let's kick off with learning in sport. In the first half, we're going to look at learning in sport, and then later about how we can apply it to learning not in sport. And Donald, I've got a question here about the language. We're used to talking about training and trainers in the context of sport, but in the organizational context, we more often use the L word, the learning word. Thank you, Pete Senge. Does that language function in the same way when it comes to sport? This might seem like a semantic quibble, but a lot of extra stuff gets freighted in with that learning word. With sport, on the other hand, is it a synonym? Training and learning, is it the same thing? How does the language work differently in this world?
Yeah, well, as I said, just in that previous sort of summary of the trajectory in which we're about to take, John, I think it's the sort of learning people who are using learning in the wrong way here. Learning for most people throughout your life is actually learning by doing. Most of what you learn in the workplace is by doing it, not going on the courses. So actually, they don't freight enough into the word learning in L&D. The problem is one of exclusion. They miss loads out. They miss all the doing, they miss all the practice, they miss the interleaving, they miss space practice, they miss all the things that really allow learning to be transferred into action and call it a training course. That whole PowerPoint texty thing. So, and I think my experience in life is that those who concentrate on performance support, for example, where you're actually doing things in the context of your job, learning in the flow of work, or in sports, are far more authentic in the use of the word learning than people who think learning is text-based education from a PowerPoint or an e-learning course.
Okay, so how does it work in sport then? Tell us about learning in sport, training, coaching, blah, blah, blah.
I gave a lecture at Dublin City University, which is where the Irish rugby team coached, and they were all high-end international sports coaches. Right. And I learned a lot from them because I had a reading list and followed up and so on. Anyway, I think the one big thing is this notion of not repeating techniques, but practice. How do sports people practice as opposed to people in training courses? And it certainly is not the repetition of a technique. What has moved on, and if you go any high-end coaching, you can see this in football matches when players run onto the pitch and they're very often in little circles passing the ball to each other.
Yeah.
So the people like Keith Davis and Chow and so on, these are big high-end names in sports coaching who talk about the ecological dynamics of practice. So your skills, as a sports person, emerge through the sort of problem-solving rather than just technical, repetitive practice and instruction.
Okay.
And it's what they call a constraints-led approach. In other words, you start by doing a small set of real things. In Callum's case, he did Taekwondo. He gave me a good example of this. When you're sparring and against someone, you can use both you can kick and punch. Then you might, Callum was very good at side kicks. So first of all, he would fight somebody, but they would be told just to use their boxing skills. So he would kick against boxing. Then they would be told to just use kicks. So you constrain the opposition in such a way that you got more focus on tackling a certain attack technique by the other fighter.
Okay.
And that's a constraints-led approach. You might play, for example, five-a-side in football or a little passing game that hones those skills within a smaller context.
Like having a one-touch game where you're not allowed
Exactly.
to... Yeah.
Exactly. And you see that sometimes in rugby as well, all sorts of sports. That's a really modern thing in sports coaching, but it clearly has worked. The skills emerge through that rather than repetitive technical instruction. Do this, do that. And there's the Jia Chow is interesting from Singapore, not known for its sports in a way, but that then gets turned into sort of representative tasks. It's like break it down into tasks, and then you carefully design these constraints, and then you bring the variability into it bit by bit and start building the skills acquisition. And a lot of it's to do with task simplification. In Callum's case, for example, he might practice his sidekick, but that gets broken down into how you stand before you go into a side kick, left, right, the angle of the kick, the position of your foot. Are you aiming for their head or their body? That sort of stuff. Everything's broken down into tasks and a lot of focus on giving the learner the ability to acquire skills by discovering their own solutions as they go forward. And I saw that with my own eyes when Callum was training. It was highly constrained, very focused, very intentional. And there was another interesting one, which is variability matters. In a training course, you tend to get this one narrative, one story, theory. Do this, you go back, everything will be fine. Whether it's leadership training, whatever. Be empathetic, be this, blah, be that. And of course, it never works when you go back because the world is complex and hugely variable. And the one big thing I learned from watching the sports coaching stuff is that there's a guy called Richard Schmidt who's a set expert, Nicola Hodges, another one, and they talk about variability, feedback, variability in your practice schedules. A good example would be basketball. I saw a very good years ago in America at a conference in Miami. I saw the coach for the Lakers. He was just the shooting coach.
Yeah.
And he stood on the stage, gave a 45-minute talk while shooting points in a basket into the basket, never missed one.
Yeah.
It was I've played basketball. You have no idea how difficult it is just getting that ball into the basket. And he was popping them in. But then he talked about variability. In other words, you don't stand into a 3-point basketball from the one position and that's it. You move to the side, you get players attacking you. It's the variability of the skill. And the same is true, I think, in workplace learning and education as well, to be honest. People don't get enough variability. We'll talk about that in the second half. But variability really does matter. Feedback, demonstrating the right way to do it, practice, observation, expertise, learning, the whole dynamics of learning and context really matters.
Right.
And of course, there's a big name here, which anybody who knows about learning theory will know, and that's K. Anders Ericsson, who we've mentioned previous. He was big on this concept of deliberate practice. In other words, how did the Beatles become the Beatles? Well, they played for 10,000 hours in Hamburg. And a lot of people criticize that 10,000 hours. He didn't actually have a 10,000 hour rule. It was a bit of a caricature of him. Nevertheless, there's something in this.
Yeah.
If you're going to be a musician, you just have to practice, guys. Like
an awful lot.
Get to the upper hole.
Yeah, in jazz they call it wood shedding. At a certain point, a jazz musician would go off and just practice, and then come back as Charlie Parker or John Coltrane or whatever. Wood shedding was the is the thing.
That's right. And we'll come to this in the second half as well, because I don't think we pay enough attention to that notion of practice. We don't really, in training, you don't have a practice methodology, maybe 10 multiple choice questions or something stupid. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, we have kind of role plays and, multimedia, kind of, the kind of stuff that Make Real do in Brighton.
And that's exactly what we'll come to, the scenario-based
virtual reality,
role-playing.
Scenario-based. And you did a load of that stuff at Epic, I remember, a very early DWP thing.
And I want to really surface that in the second half, John, because,
we'll leave that till later.
No, thanks for bringing that up, because that's exactly the direction we're going in here.
Yeah.
We had several signals in the past, but a lot of that got dropped, I think, I feel, But I think another thing, Callum was really keen on SDT theory, the notion that it's the self. The focus has to be on the sports person themselves acquiring those skills. Right. You're just not going to learn it by some sort of form of osmosis, sitting in lectures and watching videos or whatever. You really have to do it. And then secondly, SDT, the interesting thing about Desi's theory is there is that notion of autonomy by the sports person themselves. Learner. The second thing is you get your success by just getting better at something. You don't get it by making it fun. I mean, the thing about Callum's sports schedule when he was fighting, in big European tournaments, and all, he'd be out 4 or 5 times a week running up and down steps, coming back in pain. You see kids throw up in international level while they're training. This was a hardcore process. You have to build yourself for the peak just before the competition. And I think that's what Desi was saying with that theory, that learning isn't about fun. It's really about that. It's not about throwing up either, of course, but it is about that deliberate external focus and attention, learner autonomy, feeling you're getting better. Another really interesting thing that Callum mentioned to me when he came across that theory was the social aspect. So Callum was a sparring expert, fighting people one-on-one, but it was the team that mattered. He was saying without the team, there is no individual sportsman, even though it was one-on-one. And the team, the social context was all important. I thought that was an interesting aspect here. And of course, there's the technology stuff.
So do you want to move on to the technology now?
Yeah, sure.
Gadgets, AI, and analytics. So you'll all be aware of how great an impact technology has had on sport and also on exercise. Anyone who runs or rides a bike with a device on their wrist or in their pocket will be aware of the fact that we can now record a huge amount of data about performance. My wife is recovering from a hip operation, and she was boasting about the number of steps she'd done yesterday, and we were kind of comparing it, and she was sort of indicating I'm not doing enough, as usual. But even if you don't do a lot of exercise yourself, but just spectate on sport, you'll be aware of how massive a change there's been. Sport is now hugely data-driven. I've seen this as, the only sport I really get that much involved with is Tour de France. It's an incredible amount of data they have at their fingertips in kind of managing a team. We see it more in football now. You'll see the kind of, they'll be able to tell you the number of passes each team has done. They have this kind of momentum graph for the two teams as the match goes on. More and more of it. So how's this affected learning and training in sport, more particularly, Donald?
Yes, that's right. I think technology has had a massive influence on learning and training in sport, but it's not really the technology. It's the data, it's the analytics, which there's always been a dearth of in training. Whether people got 70% on a multiple choice question is about as far as many people go in this front. But actually, obviously, to have real skills acquisition, you need higher levels of analytics and measurement. Now, the sports thing is interesting because they were a bit ahead of the game on this, I think. Moneyball was great. If you've not seen the movie or read the book, it's fantastic because that gives you an insight into how this exploded in the US. A more contemporary example, and one closer to home for me, is Tony Bloom at Brighton, who has an AI analytics company called Jamestown, and they are separate from the football club. But Brighton is a very small town with a hugely successful Premiership team known throughout the world. Whenever I travel, people, Brighton, they know it through the football team. And that's because they use analytics at the source, where do you do buy players? They're looking at analytics on the field. Every football player has a little gadget in their back now, so that you know where, how much they've run and so on and so forth, how many passes they made. All that analytics on the field is what everybody focused on. What Bloom focused on was, where do I find these young players? Where are they? What are they worth? Look at their analytics. He does that with managers as well. So we have the youngest manager in the Premier League, German, hugely successful. And what we do, of course, is we nurture them, train them using the same data techniques and sell them on for a huge amount of profit, which sustains a small club. We're a little fish in a big bowl, as it were. So I think we've seen examples of that really work. And I think that's a perfect example. To give you two really concrete examples where this works well. One, basketball is another sport I really like. I knew Nick Nurse, who was the coach of the Brighton Bears when we won the league way back in the day. He went on to win the NBA, believe it or not, for Toronto in America.
Wow.
But the interesting thing about basketball is I have a thing called a smart basketball. So the basketball itself has all sorts of sensors within it. So it knows the exact parabola the basketball took, the speed it went, the force that was applied to it, and so on. So you're getting down to gadgetry. Also, video is hugely important. And the other one, myself and Callum look at quite a bit, is Jabber, Jabbr. That's actually for boxing. And so boxing was part of his sport as well as kicking. Sounds terribly violent, but it's actually point scoring. But the detailed analysis you get on, when people watch boxing, if you don't really know much about the sport, you think it's all just people doing haymakers at each other. Sometimes descends into that, but actually it's a massively and highly skilled and precise sport. Yeah. And when you look at the analytics, we look at Jabber quite a lot, even UFC. The amount of skills acquisition and detailed technique that goes into these fights is almost beyond belief if you know what you're looking at.
Yeah.
And so I think we've seen technology allows the analytics to be harvested. And then, of course, it's all down to the interpretation. And we'll come to that in a minute because you mentioned the role playing, and video is starting to play a bigger role in training because of AI and the things you can do. You can load up videos, for example, on performance, whether it's your presentation skills and so on and so forth, and get AI to actually then assess your performance. There's some amazing things happening here, but we'll move on to that
You mentioned video there. When it comes to football particularly, before we move on, do you have a view on VAR? I know kind of, in popular culture, it's a kind of a bit of a bugbear.
Well, I think it's actually quite good on fouls because I think it just clarifies things a lot of the time, the close-up to see what actually happened. The big one is offside, which is very contentious. The offside thing's interesting because, I'm getting on a bit, and I remember when the offside rule's always been contentious.
Yeah.
And it actually came out of the split from football from rugby. So rugby is all about offside. The whole game's based on the offside rule. You can't put the ball forward from the line. And that's where the offside rule originated. But football's always had trouble in measuring it. It's an analytics problem, really, because it's it can be a finger. Where do you do that? I actually think it should be a more body-based thing rather than arms and limbs and toes.
Yeah.
I think we've had about 3 or 4 major reforms in the offside rule. I think there'll be another one on VR, which is to try and rationalize this. Well, he just had his finger there. That doesn't make any sense, does it? If they're parallel, he should be onside.
Yeah.
So I think we'll move towards that at some point. But I do believe in the VAR thing because I think by and large, tennis needed it, and we don't think much about tennis now. It records those tiny little clips of the net on a serve, but the ball was in and out, and everybody's quite happy with that. And I think that will happen in football as well.
Calls. Yeah. Interesting. There was in the World Cup final, there was a moment when there was a goal was disallowed for the Spanish, I think, for offside. And seriously, the head of fact turned to me and said, "I don't understand why he was offside." I looked at her in astonishment. I said, "Do you want me to explain the offside rule to you? Seriously?" He said, "Oh, no, sorry, I forgot." Yes.
Yeah, well, there were all sorts of The interesting thing about this World Cup was the number of Americans on social media who were completely baffled by this offside rules. But of course, Americans being Americans wanted to change every rule.
Yeah.
The golden, the goal. And many of these rules we've tried before, let's change the size of the goals. What?
Yeah, let's cancel the red cards.
Yeah, that's right. My response to the Americans was also, until you stop watching a sport where men wear motorcycle helmets and soft furnishings and only run for about 22 seconds, come back to us.
And which you can't practically play in the park, really. Yeah. But anyway, exactly. We're getting back into that thing of national rivalries, so I think it's time to blow the halftime whistle. Back to the dressing room. Back to the dressing room, Donald. And change ends. So we're now into the second half. I hope you all had a refreshing half-time break, a massage, whatever. Donald and I bound back onto the field with renewed vigour, having each received a motivational boost or a hairdryer from our respective team managers. But no change of tactics from either team. In this half, as promised, we're going to cover what people professionals in corporate and institutional learning alike can learn from sports. And I think I can promise you it will not be the sort of fluffy and ultimately unedifying keynote I've occasionally witnessed in the course of my career in people industries that they give at conferences and dinners by sporting celebs. I seem to go to quite a lot of these at one stage of my career, and I saw Jackie Charlton twice, who was very, very entertaining, very funny, but I don't think we really learned anything about sport in that. So, Donald, we expect more than that from Great Minds on Learning. So tell us, what should we learn from sports learning that we can apply within the world of workplace learning and institutional learning and education?
Okay, well, hopefully in the first half we saw that whole notion of that practice and performance matter, more realism, context, all that sort of performance-driven training is required here. More doing. Well, it's more focus on goals, more practice, more data we ended up on. And I suppose there are some things where you rightly said, we have been trying this, but maybe not enough of it. And I'd like to run through some things where we can learn from this in the world of training. One is the scenario-based role-playing stuff.
Yeah.
Well said, John. So let's start with that. Then go into coaching, because most sports people rely a lot on personal coaching and coaching for the team and so on. I'd like to touch upon that. Then also deliberate and desirable practice, two big features that come out of learning theory. And then the multimodal thing, which you rightly mentioned, John, let's touch on that a little bit, because with AI especially, you'll be able to generate this stuff, interpret video and so on. We can touch with that. Performance support, and then the tech and data thing towards the end. So let's run through this, mirror the first half by discussing training and picking up on some of those topics.
Okay, so what technique in teaching and learning do you think captures the idea of practice and context when it comes to scenario-based?
Yeah, well, the great thing about, it's not as if this has been totally absent, but it's quite rare. The scenario-based training, even in e-learning, is quite rare because it's quite difficult, expensive to build and so on.
Yeah, because you don't just build one linear thing. If you've got branching, you have to build all the branches as well.
That's right. Now, the great thing about technology now, AI, and I've been involved in this, is you can actually do a template thing and produce like 100 scenarios from your template, because it will produce all the characters, the branching, and the scripted dialogue. So that there's some wonderful things you can do now super quickly and super cheaply. But to go back to the beginning on the scenario-based thing, I always used to talk about this, by using the question, why do pilots go through hundreds of hours of scenario and simulation training on a simulator, and nobody else seems to do it? And that's because pilots go down with a plane. Nobody else in their life goes down if they're not trained adequately. Not even doctors. You can kill people, you still don't get sacked. So I think there's a lesson to be. I always thought that was a good line, that, because it shows that it works. Would you go on an EasyJet flight if the pilot hadn't been through those simulations? I'd be petrified, because they don't learn it from books, or PowerPoints. They learn it by doing. And that's the great thing about scenario-based stuff. You get them to do something. And of course, the great advantage of scenarios and full simulations is that the performance then is easy to observe and assess. You know whether they've got the skill or not, because they learn it by doing. Completion in itself then becomes a good measure of the competence and the work done. It shows that it's been worth the investment. So I think the great thing about scenario training now, I mean, we've been involved in this in healthcare, is that you can massively lower the cost and time to build these scenarios. And that's what held us back before. The bottleneck was that you needed a lot of SMEs, designers, dialogue writing, feedback writing, media production, and so on. And then an expensive platform, all the branching had to be delivered. Now, but with AI, we found that we can generate this stuff very, very quickly. The branching, the writing, even the videos if they're necessary. And then, of course, you've had a lot of interest in the AI coaches, tutors, where you can embed these scenarios in more traditional tutoring environments.
Right.
And then you've got the whole VR, AR, XR thing, which is coming along as well. There's a whole lot of activity there, which really falls into this basket of scenario and simulation training, because you're not going to go into a VR system and deliver multiple choice questions, although people do, bizarrely. But I think you were right in mentioning that, John, that role-playing, scenario-based stuff has a chance to breathe and come of age because it's cheaper and quicker to deliver.
And I've seen a lot of kind of, from companies like Make Real, sort of rather cheaper alternatives. You're not building out a whole world and everything, but you're doing kind of interviewing practice and things like difficult conversations, which is a soft skills standard, as you know. It can be very good for that. I think the interesting thing for me about scenario-based training is that it really does, it can, even at kind of a lo-fi level of reproduction, can actually give you real emotions. I remember this about a DWP piece that you did at Epic, which was about really difficult conversations with claimants and so on. When the guy gets up and kind of throws the table over, you really feel a bit of a chill of fear, and that is important, isn't it? As compared to reading it in a book.
It's one of the few, I think it's one of the few examples where you get that hyper realism. I remember another one that I did, his very first big simulation I did for BT on interviewing skills, where we had people on the screen who came up randomly, you had to interview them. And we measured the head so it was about the right distance you'd interview somebody in a real room. And I remember doing those, and we had a thing called sentence construction. This was before AI. It was an AI. It was my first ever AI project, way back in the 90s, really. And the interesting thing there's how quickly you got into really that loss of suspension of disbelief, effectively, like being in the movies. You really believed you were interviewing somebody on the screen. It took about 3 questions, and suddenly, you would ask a question like, did you go to university? And they would come back and say, well, that's on my CV. What you thought? That's on my CV. Yeah, of course I did. And boom, you had a mistake. And you literally felt embarrassed at having asked the question. So that's the beauty of these things: real context, real practice, real doing.
Is there a bit of learning theory in there? I forget who it was who did it, but it came about that thing that, to tell a story, you don't need kind of Christopher Nolan style production values. You can do it with stick people, and if the story is compelling enough, that will engender emotions in us because of the way that our brains are wired. You don't need the highest production value to make it emotionally valued. Is that Reeves and Nass?
Yeah, well, there are two. Mayer was one who the less is more redundancy principle in his multimedia. Nass and Reeves absolutely on that as well. I mean, I wrote a whole book on this, really, the learning experience design. I'm doing the second edition of that book as we speak. And the principle there is really just less is more. And in the book I've just been doing the second edition, that less and more, for example, in scenarios, you can do lots of mini scenarios. You don't have full-blown business simulations. You can do mini simulations and scenarios that work beautifully well. So I think it's a principle. It's well worth mentioning there, John. Yeah.
Okay.
So Mayer, Nass, and Reeves. Yeah.
Okay. So let's move along to coaching, and we do hear a lot about coaching in the L&D world, and especially now about AI coaching. So what role we have sports coaches in sports, but what role does the coach play in learning? Is it similar, different?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about a coach in sport is how important that role is for the sports person. because in every practice session, you normally get the same coach or set of coaches. That's certainly what I observe. It becomes a very close relationship.
Yeah.
Of course, that's rarely true in the workplace. Your manager might be your coach, but they're not really, because they don't have the skills to coach properly. Now, I think this is another thing that will come of age through AI because of the whole dialogue thing. It's possible. And we've seen lots of examples of that emerge in the marketplace already. I was involved in one where we actually built something which helped mentors mentor. So there's a whole coaching mentoring thing coming of age because of AI in the training world. But I think, and also that notion that an AI coach can be available 24/7, endlessly patient, it's sort of private, anonymous.
Yeah.
And completely consistent in whatever pedagogy you feed into it at the back end. So, and it can work, for you personally, because it can have this massive memory of what you are as a learner. So I think we've got something to learn here from sports coaching, because I think there's all sorts of examples of types of coaches that we can use here. The book on learning experience design has a big taxonomy of all this. You have the sort of goal-setting coaches, leadership coaches, of course, are the norm. I'm somewhat suspicious of that, to be honest, at times. Socratic reflection, skills practice, all that sort of stuff. There's many, many types. Performance support coaches, specialist domain stuff. You could be a coach in an area of expertise for people in healthcare that do that. Difficult conversation coaches you mentioned, that was a good one. But a general coach, coaching research has been around for some time here. We know it works. I think it was Jones way back 2017 or something that came out with all the evidence that workplace coaching was definitely associated with the improvements in learning. And learning outcomes. The Boson-Jones stuff, I think it was a big meta study on workplace coaching, showed that the effectiveness depended on the quality of the coaching, though. That's what really mattered. And I think that's what we miss here. I think we've got a lot of sort of second, third-rate coaching, whereas coaching in sports is almost always first-rate because you have dedicated coaches. That's all they do. That's the difference.
Absolutely. And you pointed up something that it just suddenly struck me there as a big contrast. I mean, as a manager, I was aware of the fact that I was coaching the people that I work with, as in kind of seeing them through, okay, this is a difficult thing, go and do that, and let's have a look afterwards, and what do you learn from that? And kind of coaching behaviours is a part of the management skill set, but it's not the whole thing, and some people don't do it at all, and some people do it, as you say, imperfectly. In sports, being a coach is your whole job. It's a job title.
That's correct, yeah.
And the coach will be kind of the fulcrum of the thing. You don't have a manager, you have a coach.
I think the interesting thing about what's happening now is those coaches, like, you can set up an ordinary, your ordinary ChatGPT to be a coach, and it will remember what you've done in the past, and it works remarkably well. So I think that's starting to come of age, which brings us to the second big thing here, because I think there's a big thing around deliberate practice here that technology will allow us to do, but we can move onto that as well.
Yeah. So are there any parallels in learning for the productive use of deliberate and desirable practice that you were talking about in the first half?
Yeah, well, I've been struck by the recent sort of farrago or debate around the whole AI thing, because the bottom line is that your dialogue, I think, gives life to learning. If you watch a coach, it's non-stop dialogue. They're always talking to the learner. It's very intimate, and there's lots of feedback. Now, that's what technology did promise in the past, but it actually does now. You can actually have dialogue with one of those things. But the interesting thing is, so I've been involved in a lot of this over the last few years. What people make the big mistake in thinking that, well, if you go and use AI and you just get it to write the essay and you get a great mark in your essay, you'd be cheating. Oh, that's fine. Obviously, that's true. That would have been true if you bought an essay on an essay mill, if you'd looked up your stuff in Encyclopedia Britannica and just cut and paste it across, or Wikipedia, which students have been doing for years. Of course, it doesn't induce learning or give you the acquisition of skills you need. That's obvious. I don't need 40 papers to tell me that. And the problem here is that that's what we've got. We've got 40 papers showing that. Now, the truth of the matter is, and we know this from sports coaching and also people like Bjork and so on, we know this from the stuff we've discussed in many of our podcasts, John, that actually if you avoid that problem and you get tutors and coaches that actually induce desirable difficulty, deliberate practice, that goes away. Suddenly it becomes very positive. And that's been true. I mean, I mentioned that I've got all this stuff in my book on AI and productivity, but ever since 2026, when Ashok Go had his first really coach or mentor or teaching assistant, we know that this works because they're available 24/7 and that sort of thing. So people focus on the wrong papers here and miss out all the evidence that shows that when you actually use a coach or a tutor that has desirable difficulty in deliberate practice, the results are amazingly positive. The first big study here was by Keston, and these were students in Harvard's biggest physics course, a tough course. And they just compared in-learning, class-based active learning lesson with a structured AI tutor. Structured AI tutor, of course, something that actually, it was a very clever trial, this, but the AI tutor was basically resequencing in such a way that you really did pick up learning and were challenged. And you couldn't just go off and cheat through the chatbot, as it were.
Yeah.
And on there, the results were quite extraordinary, really. So the AI tutor group, and it was a very clever randomized crossover design. So it was a very, very clever paper indeed. But the AI tutor group received higher post-test scores than those in the active learning class. And it was astonishing. And not only that, they were spending less time on the learning. And then on top of that was higher engagement. So on every metric, these kids who were learning physics at Harvard benefit from not looking up AI answers on a chatbot, but from a structured AI tutor. There's another paper from Google and EDA, this was in the UK, again, exactly the same effect. When the model is producing pedagogically usable tutoring, dialogue, then it works. Now, there's a really interesting thing happened in the literature here that I think is really important right now, because we're now getting papers showing that what does work and what doesn't work with this AI tutoring, call it a sports coach model, going back to our core aim here. What works seems to be human supervised training. It's very interesting, this. So there's a brilliant paper here that I recommend to everybody by Aureopoulos. It was this year, 2026, where they had 86 schools, 83 or 86, I can't remember, schools in Uttar Pradesh in India, and they were teaching them maths. And what they did was they had the AI tutor, which is a proper tutor, but they had guides on the side. These weren't teachers, interestingly. They did a wee bit of educational work, but it was actually Khan Academy content.
Oh, yeah.
But what these guides did is help the students navigate the content, the platform, and kept them on task, made sure they weren't talking to their mates when they were meant to be learning, monitoring the progress, that sort of stuff,
Crowd control.
Which is what classroom teachers are good at, and drives them crazy.
Some of them aren't. Yeah.
Some of them aren't. But I think that was very interesting. Now, that was the first paper. That was very interesting. Now, that raised the actual on-task learning of maths went up from 7.2 minutes to 47.4 minutes a week. That was the number. Because it was such a dramatic increase. But the most important thing is that the students in the tutored schools had almost half a standard deviation bigger in terms of attainment. This is an astonishing number. This is a huge improvement amongst that group. And this is a bit like having a sports coach, somebody who keeps you on task. I think that's true of footballers. That I sponsored a grassroots football team. Bought their shirts, put the Wildfire logo on the front, and I used to go along coaching sessions, and watch them there. And it was half just keeping these 16-year-old lads in order and half training, serious training. And I think that's important. What we're learning also from another really interesting one to watch is the Alpha School. Caused a lot of controversy, this, but I've spoken to Wendy, who's one of the guides there, one of the parents. Carl Hendrick, he's well known in the learning world.
Yes.
He's been across there studying it as well. And everybody's starting to become a bit of fan when they see what's happening here, although I have some skepticism, which I'll mention
Can
at
you
the
tell
end.
us about the Alpha School? What is that?
Yeah, so what they do is have the kids do an intensive 2-hour learning model, they call it, on adaptive. It's not all AI. There's it's adaptive and AI apps. They're again supervised by guides. They call them guides. They're not So Wendy's she does a very good blog on some of this stuff, telling you exactly what they do. They're not traditional teachers. They act as motivators and sort of monitors and coaches. They're more like a sporting coach. Very interesting, this. They're using all these interesting apps, and they're keeping the kids out there for 2 hours in the morning when they're attentive. We know that's true physiologically.
Yeah.
And that people start dipping into the afternoon, and they get such achievement through this. They have a thing called Alpha Maths, Alpha Read and Alpha Write. And basically, they're squeezing 4 hours of traditional classroom learning into 2 hours.
Right.
That means you can take that extra 2 hours, and in the afternoon, the kids do things, going back to the sporting you learn by doing. And they may be building robots, learning a musical instrument, doing drama, all sorts of things,
Yeah.
Some of them academic, some not so academic. And I think that's a wonderful idea. I think it's a wonderful idea that we can free kids up from that sort of tyranny of a solid set of academic looking at the blackboard learning for 8 hours every day, 5 days a week, because clearly it's not working.
Yeah.
Huge numbers of kids just fall off the end of the conveyor belt here into the neat world. We have 1 million of those currently not in employment. And I think there's something in this. However, we have to be a bit careful here because it's a private school. The evidence there is, to be fair, they did release some data. It's called Brownsville data, so you can look at that data. But nevertheless, it's a selective group of kids.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward. And I've been, I speak to Wendy. I've had some dialogue here. I think until they get a reasonable academic trial done on this in a normalized context, then scalability is still
in the public sector, maybe.
Yeah. But there's also an area I know I've got to know well. I've given lots of talks around the world on this on language learning, especially English as a second language. There are 2 big meta studies, Zhu and Wang and Du and Daniel, and they show that, and these are big 24 studies, and I think the other one was 40 studies, 40 and 24, show that AI has this massive beneficial effect on learning a language. And it's everywhere in language learning now for the obvious reason that, if you can just pick up your smartphone and speak to it in any language. You can say, be a tutor, behave like this, talk to me about football, but I want to learn the past tense in English, and it will behave like a tutor.
Yeah.
This notion of a coach, an AI coach, is so fundamentally interesting here. So of course, AI can harm learning, but if it's used properly, boy, can it help us learn.
Marvelous. So multimodal learning.
Yeah.
Sports physical learning is often psychological and very text-based. How do we get over this in non-sports learning?
Yeah, well, this goes back to this Gutenberg parenthesis thing. Before Gutenberg, by and large, we've got the movie, The Odyssey, coming out.
Yeah.
And you think by reading things online that The Odyssey was a book, which of course it wasn't. It was primarily a piece of...
a performance.
A performance. It was entirely oral, that's right. Now, in a sense, I think that's why, a lot of very academic people get very sniffy and critical about the movie when it comes out for whatever reason.
Oh, they already are, yeah. I mean, it's out now,
it doesn't
they are.
Proper piece of armor or whatever, But actually, it's mythological, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the point about the Gutenberg parenthesis was, his thesis is that we came out after the internet, but AI especially has put the closed brackets on just using text. And I've said this often, you send your kid off to school at 5, they come out, if they go to university, do a master's, basically most of what they've done, some degrees are not like this, but most degrees are reading, writing, and critiquing text. That's it. And so you're not really acquiring a lot of extra skills there. And it comes as a bit of a surprise when you pop out the other end and you go into the workplace and people are going, well, I don't care what degree you've got. Here you are, guys, get on with it. And you learn by doing. So I think the multimodal thing that's come along through AI has been a sort of just a breath of fresh air and freeing us up. I think it will continue. I honestly think kids will not read as many books as they have in the past, but I'm not absolutely convinced that that's a bad thing. They still do a lot of reading. They still look at a lot of other media.
But AI is very text-based as well, isn't it? I mean, I spend most of my day kind of writing to Claude and reading the responses.
Well, that's right. The initial release, of course, was all because it was based on text-based training. It was precisely that. But the good thing now is I use the audio thing on my smartphone all the time now, especially when I'm out. And the latest release, ChatGPT's voice, the advanced voice, is so good on accepting interruptions. It's just such a leap. And you can see when robots come into your house how that's going to work like a dream. But I think, by and large, it's much more, prosaic than that, and much more mundane than that, the big benefits here. I've given several talks recently where I've brought in the accessibility issue, and if you speak to anybody with dyslexia, autism, ADHD, and the freedom they feel when they can suddenly just take text and get it in audio, do the podcasting and notebook LM, there's 101 ways to skin that accessibility cat. I think we've abandoned send kids to a degree, but now they have the technology to help themselves in this, and I think that's already proving to be incredibly useful.
Good.
But I think there's a whole load of stuff here. We talked about video. I think video assessment and evidence. You can actually assess people in video now. You load up the task and it will do the analysis. The learning performance capture, uploading and recording video. Remember, it's not only the uploading, you can create video in the multimodal world now really easily. I did one on manual handling the other day and it was perfect. Now, I remember when we used to get a full film crew to do that, it would take about a day. And now you can do it in literally 3 minutes. Crazy advance in terms of how quick and how cheap it can be. But you can use uploaded or recorded video to review real performance. And that's, record, practice, analyze the behavior in detail. You even spot errors and it will tell you. So I think even give targeted feedback, if you wanted to use it as formative assessment and support the coaching thing we've been discussing. So I think that's just one example, and that's video, but there's VR, AR, XR, audio. Just mentioned that, the use of podcasts, all sorts of things are coming in into the fore here. And I think AI is, in a sense, building that wave and moving away from bare textbooks and text. And I think that's a jolly good thing, especially in training, but also in education.
Obviously, there are when you move into things where you're actually doing stuff like playing an instrument or whatever, even haptics aren't going to kind of replace, real touch and so on. Anyway, let's move on. Performance support. Now, we hear a lot about that in L&D circles nowadays. We hear more than we actually see being done, I think. And, you and I have a lot of friends like Alfred and Bob Mosher who are very into that. How do we get that focus on performance that we see in sport? Because performance support is definitely in there in sport. How do we get it into other types of training?
Well, I think there's been a quiet revolution here that nobody's noticed, again, through AI, because there's there is 1 billion people using this stuff regularly. What's interesting about that billion people is most of it's performance support. When do you use AI? I use AI when I just stop and go, oh, Christ, I don't know that, do I? I need to look that up. Oh, I need to take a wee bit more a deep dive here. I thought I knew that, but I didn't. I do that, or I go into dialogue, or I get it to do something, and
in the flow of work all the time.
In the flow of work. So actually, AI is mostly performance support. And people are using this in the workplace, in their life, and in sports, and all sorts of things. Every time they get stuck, that's their first port of call.
It becomes your go-to, doesn't it?
Exactly. Perfect description. The go-to thing.
I even use it to kind of navigate. But I mean, if you want to do something like kind of unsubscribe from a service that you're using, a lot of companies make that really difficult to find. And right. I find reflexively now I'm going into Claude or whatever and saying, where is the unsubscribe button? How do I cancel my subscription on this site? And it knows, and it points you towards it. It's very much in the flow of work, isn't it, nowadays?
Correct. Yeah, and we're doing loads of work in the flow of work thing using agentic AI that does precisely what you've described there. It goes off and does things. It doesn't just give you a little bit like what's the next step or a checklist or something. But I think the training world has got. I often think about performance sport, in terms of Pope's line, a little learning is a dangerous thing, but so is a lot of learning. If you just shove people in these day-long courses, it's just too much. They're going to forget it all. It's not contextualized, so on and so forth. We mentioned this earlier. Suddenly, if you get this more, this Bob Mosher thing, if you get it right at that moment of need, I need this, that's what AI does. It gives you it, move on. So I think we're suddenly in a position where it's not this event-based, it's a process. You're not saying, let's have X days of classroom training or X hours of online learning. You embed these systems that actually, so we capture these big motherloads of documentation in organizations, SME knowledge, that becomes the ground truth for the performance support chatbot. So we're just delivering one called Delphi Flow. It does all the That does all the analysis of workflows.
Yeah.
It interviews SMEs. It does all that beautiful stuff, finds the critical stuff, non-critical stuff. And Delphi Go is like a chatbot, and whatever you need at that point, it gives you it. Remember, general AI will not give you company or organizational specific support because it doesn't have it in its training set. But if you put that into a sort of mother load, separate, and it accesses that so that it gives you the truth. And we've done high-end stuff. We did a podcast on this for nurses in theatre where people die. And the teaching hospital trusted the system we built so much, it's still in use. And we had a massive, not only does it reduce the search time for all that procedural information by that was about 25%, but it also gives you an increase in delivery time in a project. And that's about 70% because it's all automated.
Yeah.
The AI actually goes and finds this stuff, distills it, so on and so forth. Massive reductions in the use of SMEs. And then, of course, the feedback from the nurses in that case was extraordinary. They were getting exactly what they needed at the right time. So I think that transfer to performance, which you see in sport all the time, is now being enabled by these tools, which are much more coach-like.
Yeah.
I mean, you learn in the flow of sport in the same way that we should, by practicing and doing it, in the same way that we should be learning in the flow of work.
So that's moving us more towards the tech and data kind of heading. Sport, as we said earlier, is now saturated with the use of tech and data. Should training follow suit?
Almost inevitably, this will happen, but just because we've never been able to gather that data in the past, and now we have almost a surfeit of data. I've been involved in another project here called Study, STUDI, in Ireland, which is tackling this, this whole big students cheating type thing on essays. And what we've done there is really interesting. It's a brilliant piece of work. What they do is make sure that you're not going to change student behavior by calling them criminals and cheating and throwing them out of their course. That's clearly not going to be the solution, to turn it into some sort of toxic war, which a lot of people seem to want to do. Because I always use the line, that it's don't turn it into a cat and mouse game because the mice are winning and there are too many of them.
Yeah.
But the truth is you should be looking at changing behavior. So in that system, the students log on at the beginning and they have to look at, it's an academic course, so they have to look at lots of academic papers, but a chatbot helps them find the papers. And then the students themselves have to review the papers, but the chatbot gives them ongoing formative assessment as they're doing that.
Right.
And then the data thing, to come back to the technology here, the teacher, rather than having loads of those donuts and endless histograms, has one graph on the screen. It's called a spring graph. And if you can imagine, since we're in a podcast, a point for every student, a little dot. Coming off from that dot are the papers that student's looked at, whether the chatbot has deemed the activity worthwhile as a learning experience, a little bit of formative assessment. So, and you can zoom in and zoom out to your students. It will also, of course, just highlight those students who are struggling a bit, who haven't read the adequate number of papers in that area of the course and so on. And it's just a wonderful system, because it integrates assessment with learning.
Yeah.
And it doesn't allow you to use AI to cheat, but what it does is force your AI to do good things, which is almost coach or tutor you as you go through the learning experience. And I think that's the way some of this will go. The Alpha School thing's nowhere near that at the moment, I don't think. But I think there are some people that I know, because I've worked with them, that are really looking at that in anger and really building these systems. And that's a workable system. You can go and look at that. And in fact, if anybody's interested, there are free trials available on it as well.
Maybe you can give us a link to put in show notes for that.
Yeah, I can certainly do that. But generally, coming back to the data analytics thing, this will grow and grow and grow. But it can grow in the following way. I don't think this is all about providing data analytics to teachers and coaches so they can make decisions. It's all about decision-making, of course. A lot of data isn't about decision-making. It's like endpoint. You get stuck. I call it dashboard dazzle. But actually, the real trick here is to use that data for the machine itself to do smarter things behind the scenes. That's where all the real use of data is coming. AI is essentially that. You have an LLM trained on data. You have pre-training stuff. You have post-training agents we just mentioned, John. Things that go off and do things for you.
Yeah.
You have very specific agents that have in the study system, they're pedagogic agents. One might be a worked example agent, goes off and finds worked examples relevant to what you're learning. Another one may be a scenario-based agent. Another one might be a little formative assessment agent.
Yeah.
Now, those agents are using data, but you don't need to worry as a teacher about that data. It's the agents that are using the data to affect a change in the long-term memory of the learner. So I think it's data behind the scenes that matters, not the present. It's not all about the presentation of endless donuts and histograms to the teacher.
Yeah, not about producing lovely graphs.
Yeah.
So, Donald, looking at the clock, our 90 minutes are up. I mean, metaphorical 90 minutes. And we're in time added on for stoppages.
Great.
So how would you sum it all up now? Perhaps a late goal against the run of play.
Well, I think, in the first half, we saw, when we had a good hard look at sports coaching itself, it was quite clear that they were big on coaches and coaching. Training resembled it's a decision-making in competition, real hardcore performance, that's what they were focused on. The variability of practice and the importance of practice, the importance of desirable difficulty, deliberate practice, the direct attention that, you have to bring to learning if you're going to make it successful and really acquire skill. Feedback, lots of it, but selectively as well. Good coaches don't give constant feedback. They sometimes let things run. And also the autonomy of the learner. Sports people have to be autonomous. They're going out into that arena or whatever to do what they do on their own without the coach. And then this relentless focus on retention and transfer. And that's why I focus on performance support, because I think we should have a massive pendulum swing towards systems like that, rather than all the budget being spent on training courses. So I think, we've so much to learn from the sports coaching, their focus on things that by and large are not wholly left out, that would be totally unfair, but by and large are largely left out of these highly theoretical, very text-based, PowerPoint-based training courses.
Donald, thanks a lot for that. I think that's a really interesting session for me, I'm sure for everyone else. But now there are people on the pitch. They think it's all over. It is now. Sorry, these tedious English football references that people of a certain age might enjoy.
Yeah, I love them. I love football.
Yeah.
I want to remind you, John, that after my father reminded me of this recently, that in 1966, when England won the World Cup, I remember seeing that on television. I'm that old.
Oh, I remember jumping up and down on the sofa. Yeah.
In the year afterwards, Scotland beat England 3-2 so easily they were doing keepy-uppy on the pitch.
Yeah.
So sporting success doesn't always last that long. And of course, England still haven't won the World Cup since then. However,
you know what you've done now, Donald? You've done the equivalent of Argentina having lost the cup to Spain. Come and beat me up.
No, but let me solve your wound there, John. I was hugely impressed by the England team. Honestly, Spence, Bellingham, young players.
Oh, it's a great
who
team.
Played with grace.
I
had such a good time watching them. They will win the World Cup. I'm absolutely sure. And I shall be, as I did the night they played Mexico, on my own at 3:00 in the morning in this very room, punching the air when England scored. So
and did you enjoy that 10-goal bonanza in the bronze final or whatever it was? That was amazing.
Well, even that was good to watch, because you saw some of those players like Spence and Bellingham. You saw how good they really were. Yeah. They're young, really young, but they have so much potential. And that's what learning's about, isn't it? Bringing young people on, giving them skills so that they can do what they want in life and progress and flourish.
Right.
Good on them.
Absolutely. So thanks everybody for listening. Look out for the next episode. We'll be back in your feed before you know it. Bye-bye.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. We'd also like to extend a heartfelt thanks to our sponsors for this season.